In 1924, when the Vanderbilt family's 50-room mansion on the Hudson River was being demolished, workers discovered a room beneath the marble floors that appeared on no architectural plans. Inside the industrial cold storage facility, they found 47 different identity cards, a ledger filled with special menu recipes, and a sentence carved into the walls: "The richest blood makes the strongest family." For 35 years, America's wealthiest family's special wine wasn't actually wine, and the special meat served at Gilded Age feasts didn't come from any animal species. So, how did the Vanderbilt family keep this truth hidden for so long? Before we descend into the darkness that lurked beneath America's most glamorous mansion, I need to ask something of you. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the horrifying truths hidden behind the facades of wealth and power. If you're ready to learn what really happened in the shadows of America's Gilded Age, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover the stories that powerful families tried to erase forever. Now let's journey back to 1889. When fortune and horror walked hand in hand along the Hudson River. The year 1889 represented the absolute peak of America's Gilded Age, that glittering era when industrial titans built fortunes so vast, they made European royalty seem modest by comparison. The Vanderbilt family stood at the pinnacle of this new American aristocracy. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the legendary Commodore, controlled a railroad empire worth over $200 million, equivalent to nearly $6 billion today. His mansion on Fifth Avenue was the largest private residence in New York City, but it was his summer estate on the Hudson River, a sprawling property known as Riverside Manor, where the family's darkest secrets would flourish. Riverside Manor was a masterpiece of Gilded Age excess. The main house contained 50 rooms decorated with marble imported from Italy, wood paneling from French chateaux, and artwork purchased from impoverished European nobles. The estate grounds covered 400 acres of manicured lawns, formal gardens, private docks and woods that provided absolute privacy from the outside world. But it was what lay beneath the marble floors of the wine cellar that made this property truly unique among America's great estates. The mansion's official wine cellar was legendary among New York society. It housed over 10,000 bottles of the finest French wines, champagnes and spirits, curated by European experts and valued at a fortune. But behind a false wall in the deepest section of this cellar, accessible only through a hidden door disguised as wine racks, lay a second chamber that appeared on no architectural drawings and was known only to the family's inner circle. This secret room measured approximately 30 feet by 40 feet and had been constructed during the mansion's building phase in 1886. The contractor who built it, a German immigrant named Klaus Eisenberg, was paid an enormous sum for his work and his silence. According to documents discovered decades later, Eisenberg received $50,000 in cash, more than 50 times the annual wage of a skilled craftsman, with the explicit understanding that he would never speak of what he had built. He kept that promise until 1923, 1 year before the mansion's demolition, when he confessed to his priest in a deathbed statement that was immediately sealed by the Catholic Church. The hidden chamber was equipped with an industrial cooling system, decades ahead of its time, powered by a separate electrical generator that ensured the room maintained a constant temperature just above freezing. The walls were lined with ceramic tiles that could be easily cleaned, and a drainage system in the floor allowed for the removal of liquids. Metal hooks hung from reinforced ceiling beams, and along one wall stood a series of large zinc-lined cabinets. To anyone with knowledge of such facilities, the room's purpose was unmistakable. It was a commercial-grade cold storage facility designed for preserving large quantities of meat. The discovery of this room in 1924 would be immediately suppressed by the Vanderbilt family's legal team, but not before several workers had seen its contents and word had begun to spread through New York's immigrant communities. The 47 identity cards found in a locked metal box told a story that made even hardened construction workers feel sick. Each card bore a photograph, name, age, nationality, and a date between 1889 and 1924. All were young men, ages 18 to 35, immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Poland, and other European countries who had come to America seeking opportunity. But it was the ledger that provided the most damning evidence. Written in French, presumably to prevent servants from understanding its contents, the book documented what its author called acquisitions and preparations. Each entry included a date, a name matching one of the identity cards, physical descriptions noting height, weight, and overall health, and most disturbing of all, detailed instructions for butchering and cooking, what the ledger euphemistically called special provisions. The handwriting analysis conducted by investigators before the evidence vanished identified the author as Marcel Beaumont, who had served as the Vanderbilt family's head chef from 1885 until his death in 1920. Beaumont was a celebrated figure in New York society, known for creating elaborate multi-course dinners that left guests in awe. His culinary reputation attracted the wealthy and powerful to Riverside Manor, where invitations to the family's private dinners were among the most coveted in American high society. According to the ledger entries and supporting evidence found in the hidden chamber, the pattern began in March 1889. The first entry described an acquisition named Giuseppe Romano, a 24-year-old dock worker from Sicily who had been in America for less than 6 months. Romano had been hired for temporary work at Riverside Manor, helping to unload supplies delivered by ship to the estate's private dock. The ledger noted that he was in excellent health, strong constitution, optimal for primary preparation. Romano was reported missing by fellow workers at the Manhattan docks where he had previously worked. However, as was common with immigrant laborers of that era, the police investigation was minimal. Missing persons reports for immigrants were rarely taken seriously by authorities, who viewed such workers as transient and unreliable. Romano's disappearance was attributed to his either moving to another city for work or returning to Italy, explanations that satisfied officials who had little interest in investigating further. What actually happened to Giuseppe Romano was documented in disturbing detail in Beaumont's ledger. He had been invited to stay for dinner after completing his workday, a gesture he interpreted as kindness from wealthy employers. The meal served to Romano was drugged with laudanum, a common opiate-based medicine of the era. Once unconscious, he was brought to the hidden chamber where, according to the ledger's clinical notation, he was processed according to traditional butchering methods, and his remains were stored in the zinc-lined cabinets. The ledger indicated that Romano's prepared portions were served over the course of 3 separate dinner parties held in March and April of 1889. The guests at these dinners included some of the most prominent names in American society: railroad magnates, banking titans, steel industry leaders, and their wives. They dined on what they were told was a rare variety of veal, specially imported from Europe, and prepared using secret French techniques that Beaumont claimed to have learned during his training in Paris. This pattern would repeat 46 more times over the next 35 years. The victims were carefully selected from the pool of temporary workers hired for short-term projects at the estate. Preference was given to recent immigrants with few connections in America, men who could disappear without triggering serious investigations. The selection process was methodical and calculated, ensuring that victims were healthy, young, and unlikely to be missed. Cornelius Vanderbilt II himself, according to fragmentary evidence that survived the family's suppression efforts, believed he had discovered a secret to maintaining health and vigor that the common people would never understand. Letters between Cornelius and his wife Alice, discovered in a private collection decades later, contained veiled references to special dietary practices that Cornelius credited with his continued vitality despite advancing age. These practices, he wrote, were known to ancient ruling classes and represented knowledge that the masses could never comprehend or accept. The philosophical justification for these practices drew from a twisted interpretation of social Darwinism, the pseudo-scientific ideology popular among Gilded Age elites. Cornelius and his circle believed that their wealth and power proved their inherent superiority, and that this superiority entitled them to privileges beyond conventional morality. In their view, consuming the flesh of the lower classes was not murder, but rather a natural expression of their position at the top of society's hierarchy. They were the apex predators of the human species, and their special dinners were simply the ultimate expression of power. The guest list for these dinners read like a registry of America's ruling class. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel empire built modern America, attended at least 3 documented dinners. J.P. Morgan, the banking titan who would later save the American economy from collapse, was a regular guest. Members of the Astor family, the Rockefeller dynasty, and numerous other Gilded Age fortunes were documented attendees. Whether all guests knew what they were consuming remains unclear from surviving evidence, though the ledger contained notes suggesting that some were initiated into the full knowledge, while others remained ignorant. The staff at Riverside Manor operated under strict hierarchies of knowledge. Lower-level servants, including maids, groundskeepers and junior kitchen staff, had no access to the hidden chamber and no awareness of what occurred there. However, a core group of trusted employees, all of whom were paid extraordinary salaries and bound by confidentiality agreements, backed by threats of legal destruction, assisted in the operation. These included Beaumont himself, the estate's head butler, the private secretary to Cornelius Vanderbilt, and a personal physician who conducted medical examinations of potential victims under the guise of routine health screenings for workers. The physician, Dr. Harrison Blackwell, played a particularly disturbing role. His private medical journals, portions of which survived the family's evidence suppression, revealed a man who viewed his work as scientific research rather than murder. He conducted what he called comparative studies, examining the effects of consuming human tissue on health markers, recording detailed observations about the physical condition of dinner guests before and after participating in these meals. His conclusions, written in the detached language of medical research, suggested that regular consumption did indeed produce measurable improvements in vitality, though he acknowledged that psychological factors and the placebo effect cannot be ruled out as contributing variables. The mechanics of victim selection and acquisition were carefully planned to avoid detection. Temporary workers would be hired through intermediaries, men who operated employment agencies serving the immigrant community. These intermediaries received substantial payments for ensuring a steady supply of workers who met specific criteria: young, healthy, recently arrived in America, and lacking established connections that might trigger serious investigation if they disappeared. The intermediaries themselves may not have known the full truth of what became of the workers they sent to Riverside Manor, though their willingness to accept large payments for silence suggests some level of complicity. Once a victim had been selected and brought to the estate, the process moved quickly. The initial invitation to stay for dinner came after a full day of legitimate work, creating the impression of employer generosity. The drugged meal rendered the victim unconscious within 30 minutes, and their body would be immediately transported to the hidden chamber. The actual killing and processing occurred there, with Beaumont supervising the work that he described in his ledger as requiring precision and artistry comparable to any other aspect of haute cuisine. The disposal of evidence was equally methodical. Clothing and personal effects were burned in the estate's industrial boilers, the same furnaces used to heat the mansion during winter. Bones and other remains that could not be consumed were ground into powder using industrial equipment, then scattered in the Hudson River from the estate's private dock during nighttime hours. The cold storage facility ensured that prepared portions could be preserved for weeks or even months, allowing the family to host multiple dinners from a single victim. As the years passed and the practice continued, the operation became increasingly sophisticated. By the early 1900s, Beaumont had developed what he considered his signature recipes, techniques for preparing human flesh that maximized tenderness and flavor while disguising its true nature. His ledger contained detailed notes comparing different preparation methods, the effects of various marinades and cooking temperatures, and preferences expressed by regular guests. These notes were written with the same professional pride that a legitimate chef might take in perfecting any complex dish. The dinners themselves followed the elaborate protocols of Gilded Age entertaining. They were multi-course affairs lasting several hours, featuring finest wines, crystal glassware, and service that exemplified the era's obsession with European aristocratic style. The special meat was never the only item served, but rather incorporated into a larger menu that included conventional ingredients. This mixing served both to disguise the special preparation and to provide plausible deniability for guests who might later claim they had no knowledge of what they had consumed. Musical entertainment typically accompanied these dinners, with professional musicians performing in an adjacent room. The combination of fine wine, elaborate food, and cultural sophistication created an atmosphere where wealthy guests could feel they were participating in something exclusive and refined, an experience that separated them from the common masses. That this experience literally involved consuming those masses was an irony that some initiated guests apparently found amusing, based on fragmentary diary entries discovered years later. The psychological dynamics among those who knew the full truth were complex and disturbing. Letters and diary fragments suggest that some participants experienced initial revulsion, followed by gradual acclimation, and eventually a sense of transgressive excitement. For men and women whose wealth had removed virtually every limitation on their desires, this represented perhaps the ultimate forbidden experience, the final boundary between themselves and ordinary humanity. The act of participating in these dinners became a bond among the initiated, a shared secret that simultaneously unified and isolated them from the rest of society. Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899 at age 55, his death attributed to complications from a stroke. However, his participation in these dinners had spanned the entire decade of the 1890s, suggesting that whatever health benefits he believed he was obtaining did not prevent his relatively early death. Following his death, control of Riverside Manor passed to his widow Alice, and eventually to their children. The evidence suggests that the practice continued under family management, with the ledger documenting acquisitions as late as 1923, 1 year before the mansion's demolition. The decision to demolish Riverside Manor in 1924 came after the property had stood largely vacant for several years. The Vanderbilt family's focus had shifted to other properties, and the massive estate was expensive to maintain. The demolition was contracted to a firm that employed primarily Italian and Irish immigrant workers, many of them relatives or friends of men who had disappeared in previous decades. When these workers discovered the hidden chamber and its contents, the reaction was immediate and intense. Several workers threatened to go to the police with what they had found. Others wanted to sell their story to newspapers. The Vanderbilt family's response demonstrated the power that extreme wealth could wield in 1920s America. Within 24 hours of the discovery, family attorneys had descended on the demolition site. Workers were offered substantial payments in exchange for signed confidentiality agreements. Those who refused were threatened with deportation, criminal prosecution for trespassing and theft, or blacklisting from future employment. The identity cards, ledger, and all other physical evidence were seized by family representatives. Several workers did approach newspapers with their stories, and at least 2 major New York papers prepared articles about the discovery. However, these articles never ran. The Vanderbilt family's influence extended deep into New York's media establishment, and editors were persuaded through a combination of legal threats, promises of future access, and financial considerations to kill the stories. One journalist who persisted in investigating the case found himself suddenly fired and unable to secure employment at any reputable publication. The Catholic Church also played a role in suppressing information. Several workers who discovered the chamber were devout Catholics who brought their knowledge to priests in confession. The church hierarchy, unwilling to create a scandal involving one of New York's most prominent families, and many of whose members were substantial donors, instructed these priests to maintain confessional silence and discourage parishioners from speaking publicly. The deathbed confession of Klaus Eisenberg, the contractor who had built the hidden chamber, was immediately sealed by church authorities and remained locked in archives for over 80 years. By 1925, the demolition of Riverside Manor was complete. The property was subdivided and sold, with no marker or memorial indicating what had occurred there. The 47 men whose identity cards were found in that hidden chamber received no justice, no acknowledgement, and no burial. Their families, if they even knew the men had disappeared, were left with permanent uncertainty about their fates. The wealthy families who had participated in or enabled these crimes faced no consequences whatsoever, their reputations intact and their fortunes secure. But suppression, no matter how powerful, can never be completely absolute. Fragments of evidence survived in private collections, sealed church archives, and the memories of workers who had been sworn to silence, but who shared whispered stories within their communities. Over the following decades, researchers and journalists would occasionally stumble upon pieces of this story, though never enough to form a complete picture or to overcome the barriers erected by wealth and power. The question that haunts us now is not just what happened in that hidden chamber beneath Riverside Manor, but how many other such chambers existed in the mansions of America's Gilded Age elite. Were the Vanderbilts unique in their practices, or were they simply one example of a broader phenomenon that occurred wherever extreme wealth and power created opportunities for transgression without consequence? The evidence suggests that similar practices may have occurred at other estates, though most would have been even more carefully hidden than the Vanderbilt chamber. What we know for certain is that 47 young men came to America seeking opportunity and found instead an early death at the hands of the nation's wealthiest family. Their story represents not just individual tragedy, but a broader truth about the Gilded Age. Beneath the glamorous surface of unprecedented prosperity lay a darkness that consumed the vulnerable and powerless. The same industrial revolution that created massive fortunes also created a vast pool of desperate workers whose lives were considered expendable by those who controlled the new economy. The Vanderbilt family's wine cellar was famous throughout New York society for containing some of the finest vintages in America. But the true nature of what was stored in that cellar's hidden chamber represented something far more disturbing than any wine collection: evidence of how easily the wealthy could transform human beings into commodities, how readily society would look away from crimes committed by the powerful, and how thoroughly truth could be suppressed when sufficient resources were devoted to that task. As we close this first chapter of the Vanderbilt wine cellar secret, remember that the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of Gilded Age mansions often concealed horrors that matched anything found in medieval dungeons. The difference was that these modern horrors were justified not by ancient superstition, but by the pseudo-scientific ideology of social Darwinism and the absolute conviction of the wealthy that their success proved their superiority and entitled them to privileges beyond morality. In our next episode, we will explore how this practice continued and evolved, who else among America's elite families participated, and what happened to those who tried to expose the truth. We will also examine the broader network of servants, suppliers, and enablers who made these crimes possible, and we will reveal evidence suggesting that similar practices occurred at other locations along the Hudson River and beyond. The hidden chamber beneath Riverside Manor was not an isolated phenomenon. As investigators would discover decades later, the Vanderbilt family's practices were part of a broader network among America's Gilded Age elite, a secret society of wealth and power that shared not just business interests and social connections, but also the darkest of appetites. Before we reveal how deep this conspiracy truly went, let me ask, are you ready to learn just how many of America's most respected family names participated in these horrors? Hit that like button and tell me in the comments if you think wealth corrupts absolutely, or if evil exists independent of fortune. Let's find out together. In 1897, a private yacht named the Prometheus departed from the Vanderbilt family's Hudson River dock, carrying 12 passengers. All were members of what they called the Epicurean Society, though no such organization appeared in any social registry or club directory. The guest list included 3 Vanderbilts, 2 Astors, J.P. Morgan himself, railroad magnate Collis Huntington, and 5 other titans of American industry whose combined wealth exceeded the gross domestic product of most nations. The yacht sailed north along the Hudson, stopping at 4 different estates over a 3-day period. At each location, the group participated in elaborate private dinners that followed the same pattern established at Riverside Manor. This cruise was documented in a private journal kept by William Astor III, fragments of which were discovered in 1967 when his great-grandson was sorting through family papers before donating them to a historical society. Before the donation could be completed, family attorneys intervened and removed several pages. However, a researcher had already photographed portions of the journal, and these images revealed the existence of what Astor called our sacred brotherhood of elevated tastes. His entries described the dinners in euphemistic terms, but made clear that participants understood exactly what they were consuming and took pride in their willingness to transgress boundaries that limited ordinary people. The network extended far beyond the Hudson River Valley. Estate records and correspondence discovered over the years suggest that similar facilities existed at mansions in Newport, Rhode Island, where America's wealthiest families built their most extravagant summer homes. The Breakers, the massive Vanderbilt mansion that still stands today as a museum, contained wine cellars of enormous size. While no hidden chamber has been officially discovered there, several researchers have noted architectural anomalies in the basement structure that suggest spaces unaccounted for in existing floor plans. In Philadelphia, the mainline estates of industrial families showed similar patterns of immigrant worker disappearances. Between 1885 and 1920, police records documented over 200 missing persons reports filed by immigrant communities in Philadelphia, describing young men who had left for temporary work at wealthy estates and never returned. The investigation rate for these cases was less than 5%, and not a single case resulted in charges being filed against any estate owner or manager. The social class divide of the Gilded Age meant that crimes against the poor, particularly immigrants, received minimal attention from authorities who served at the pleasure of the wealthy. The network's operation required extensive infrastructure beyond the physical facilities at each estate. A supply chain of complicit individuals enabled the continuous acquisition of victims while maintaining the secrecy essential to avoiding exposure. Employment agencies serving immigrant communities were key nodes in this network. Agency operators received substantial payments to direct workers to specific estates while maintaining plausible deniability about the workers' ultimate fate. These operators selected victims based on criteria provided by estate managers: recent arrivals with minimal English, no established family connections in America, and robust physical health. One such operator, an Irish immigrant named Patrick O'Brien, who ran a labor agency on New York's Lower East Side, left behind documents that partially survived after his death in 1919. O'Brien's ledgers showed payments from multiple wealthy estates that far exceeded normal placement fees. Besides certain worker names were notations in code that investigators later interpreted as indicators that these individuals had been sent to estates participating in the network. Over 15 years, O'Brien's agency placed approximately 300 workers at these locations, with 78 of them never returning to collect their wages or maintain contact with the agency. O'Brien's conscience apparently troubled him in his final years. Letters to his brother in Ireland, discovered decades later, contained vague references to terrible knowledge and sins beyond forgiveness. In one letter dated 1918, he wrote, "I have fed lambs to wolves for 30 years, and though the wolves wore fine clothes and spoke with educated tongues, they were wolves nonetheless. I will face judgment, knowing I traded souls for gold." He died before ever making a formal confession or statement to authorities, and his agency's records were seized by estate attorneys immediately after his death, with most documents destroyed. The network also included corrupt police officials and politicians whose careers depended on support from wealthy patrons. When families of missing workers attempted to file reports or press for investigations, they encountered systematic obstruction. Reports were lost, investigations were closed without explanation, and families who persisted too aggressively sometimes found themselves facing deportation proceedings or criminal charges on fabricated evidence. The message was clear: the powerful were untouchable, and those who challenged this reality would be crushed. Dr. Harrison Blackwell, the physician who conducted medical examinations at Riverside Manor, was part of a small circle of doctors who served the network's participating families. His private correspondence with two other physicians, Dr. Samuel Morrison in Newport and Dr. Frederick Van Horn in Philadelphia, revealed a macabre professional collaboration. They shared observations about the supposed health effects of their employers' practices, debated optimal preparation methods from a nutritional standpoint, and discussed techniques for selecting ideal subjects. These letters, written in Latin to prevent servants from understanding their content, demonstrated that these educated professionals had fully rationalized their participation in systematic murder. The psychological dynamics among network participants evolved over time. Initial participation often involved significant anxiety and moral conflict, documented in private journals and letters. However, repeated participation typically led to desensitization and the development of elaborate justifications. Many participants came to view their practices as a form of secret knowledge inherited from ancient elites, a tradition they were preserving against the egalitarian tide of modern democracy. Some even developed quasi-religious frameworks, viewing consumption of the lower classes as a form of communion that connected them to primal forces of power and dominance. The servants who worked in these households occupied an uncomfortable position between ignorance and complicity. Lower-level staff genuinely knew nothing of what occurred in hidden chambers. However, senior servants, particularly head butlers and housekeepers who managed entire estates, necessarily possessed some knowledge. These individuals were bound by financial dependence, legal threats, and in some cases, genuine loyalty to families they had served for decades. Their silence was purchased through generous salaries, provisions for retirement, and implicit threats of what would happen if they ever spoke. One housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, who worked at a prominent Newport estate for 30 years, left behind a diary discovered by her granddaughter in 1982. The diary contained cryptic entries that suggested knowledge of disturbing activities without explicitly describing them. An entry from 1904 read, "Another special dinner tonight. I prepared the small dining room as instructed. Whatever happens behind those doors, I tell myself I do not know, though my conscience whispers otherwise. The money I send home feeds my family in Ireland. What price salvation?" Her diary ended abruptly in 1912, and family records indicate she died shortly after under circumstances described only as sudden illness. The network's participants took elaborate precautions to prevent exposure beyond the social and legal protections their wealth provided. Guests at special dinners were required to travel to estates in private transport, never in groups that might attract attention. Servants working during these events were rotated to prevent any individual from seeing too many gatherings. The dinners themselves were scheduled irregularly to avoid predictable patterns. And perhaps most importantly, discussion of the true nature of these events was strictly forbidden even among participants, with all references conducted in euphemisms and coded language. Despite these precautions, the network's existence generated persistent rumors within both high society and immigrant communities. In wealthy circles, whispers circulated about certain families hosting gatherings with unusual menus, and about individuals who had experienced dramatic improvements in health after participating in these exclusive dinners. These whispers never solidified into explicit accusations, but they created an aura of transgressive mystique around certain families that some participants apparently enjoyed. In immigrant communities, darker stories circulated about men who disappeared after taking work at specific estates. These stories took on legendary qualities, mixing factual disappearances with supernatural explanations that reflected the community's inability to believe that wealthy Americans could simply murder workers with complete impunity. Tales spoke of vampires in mansions, of devils in fine clothes, of curses that befell those who entered certain properties. While the supernatural elements were fiction, the core truth that something terrible was happening at these estates was accurate. A few individuals attempted to expose the network despite the enormous risks involved. In 1902, a journalist named Thomas Brennan, writing for a socialist newspaper in New York, published a series of articles titled "The Cannibals of Fifth Avenue." His articles connected multiple disappearances of immigrant workers to wealthy estates, and suggested that systematic murder was being covered up by corrupt police and politicians. The articles generated significant attention in working-class communities, but were dismissed by mainstream media as sensationalist fabrications designed to inflame class hatred. Brennan's investigation ended abruptly when he was arrested on charges of criminal libel brought by 3 wealthy families he had named in his articles. Unable to afford adequate legal defense, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Upon his release in 1904, he found himself unemployable and blacklisted throughout the publishing industry. He died in 1909, impoverished and alcoholic, his reputation destroyed. His research materials, which he claimed included testimony from former estate workers, disappeared during his arrest and were never recovered. Another attempt at exposure came from within the network itself. In 1913, Caroline Astor, widow of William Astor III, whose journal had documented the Epicurean Society, apparently experienced a crisis of conscience in her final months of life. According to her private nurse, Caroline attempted to make a confession to a Catholic priest in which she described unspeakable sins committed by her late husband and his associates. The priest, Father Michael Donahue, refused to violate the sanctity of confession even on his own deathbed decades later, but he did confirm that Caroline's confession had involved matters so disturbing I could scarcely believe them, yet her sincerity was absolute. Caroline Astor died days after this confession, and her will included provisions attempting to establish a fund for supporting families of missing immigrant workers. However, her family contested these provisions, arguing she had been mentally incompetent in her final days. The contested will was tied up in legal proceedings for years and eventually settled in ways that eliminated the provisions Caroline had wanted. No fund was ever established, and her apparent attempt at deathbed redemption was nullified by the family that had benefited from the crimes she sought to acknowledge. The network's practices evolved in response to changing social conditions. As the progressive era brought increased attention to labor conditions and immigrant rights, acquiring victims became more challenging. Police investigations of missing persons cases improved slightly, and labor organizations began tracking disappearances of their members more systematically. In response, network participants became more selective and cautious. The frequency of special dinners decreased, and selection criteria became even more restrictive, focusing on individuals whose disappearance would be least likely to trigger investigation. By 1920, the network was contracting. Many of the original participants had died, and younger generations showed less interest in continuing the practices. The social dynamics that had enabled the network's operation were also changing. Immigration restriction laws reduced the flow of vulnerable workers. Labor unions provided greater protection. Media attention to social issues made suppression of investigations more difficult. And perhaps most importantly, the cultural confidence of the Gilded Age elite, that absolute certainty in their right to dominate, was fading in the aftermath of World War I and the social upheavals it brought. The discovery at Riverside Manor in 1924 accelerated the network's dissolution. While the Vanderbilt family successfully suppressed most information about what was found, rumors spread widely enough to make other participating families nervous. Several estates along the Hudson River and in Newport were quietly modified during the mid-1920s, with suspicious basement chambers filled in or demolished. Documents were systematically destroyed. Elderly servants who possessed dangerous knowledge were provided generous retirement packages contingent on their continued silence, or, in some cases, simply died under convenient circumstances. By 1930, the network had effectively ceased to exist as an active organization. The hidden chambers were gone, the complicit servants were dead or silenced, and the documentary evidence had been largely destroyed. What remained were fragments, cryptic diary entries, incomplete correspondence, testimony sealed by churches and courts, and whispered stories in immigrant communities that mixed truth with myth. These fragments have allowed researchers to piece together an incomplete picture of what occurred, but the full scope and scale of the network's activities will likely never be known. The number of victims claimed by this network across all its participating estates remains uncertain. Conservative estimates based on documented missing persons reports suggest at least 200 individuals disappeared under circumstances consistent with network activity between 1885 and 1924. However, many disappearances were never officially reported, as immigrant workers who lacked legal documentation or feared authority contact simply vanished from their communities without generating any official record. The true number could be 300, 500, or even more. We will never know with certainty. What we do know is that America's Gilded Age, celebrated for its economic dynamism and cultural sophistication, harbored a darkness that consumed the vulnerable and powerless. The same industrial capitalism that created unprecedented wealth also created conditions where human beings became commodities, where extreme inequality enabled extreme transgression, and where the powerful could commit atrocities with confidence they would never face consequences. The network of elite families that participated in these practices represented not an aberration, but rather the logical extreme of Gilded Age values, the conviction that success proved superiority, and that superiority justified any action. The suppression of this history tells us something equally disturbing about American society's relationship with wealth and power. The Vanderbilt family successfully prevented any serious investigation of the Riverside Manor discovery. The Astor family sealed Caroline's confession and blocked her attempted restitution. The Morgan family and other participants ensured that no evidence ever threatened their reputations. This suppression was possible because institutions from police to media to courts ultimately served the interests of the wealthy rather than justice for victims who had no power to demand accountability. In our final episode, we will explore the long-term legacy of these crimes, examine evidence suggesting that knowledge of these practices may have survived in hidden forms, and reveal what happened to the few individuals who possessed documentary evidence and attempted to bring truth to light decades later. We will also confront the uncomfortable question of whether such practices could occur today, hidden behind the walls of contemporary wealth and protected by modern forms of power and influence. The demolition of Riverside Manor in 1924 was supposed to bury the Vanderbilt family's darkest secret forever beneath rubble and legal threats. But evidence has a strange way of surviving even the most determined suppression efforts. Before we reveal what happened to those who preserved the truth and what this history means for us today, I need you to ask yourself one question. If crimes this monstrous could be hidden by wealth and power in 1924, what horrors might be concealed behind modern walls of privilege today? Leave your answer in the comments, because confronting this question is more important than ever. Let's discover the final chapter together. In 1967, a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Hartman was conducting archival work for her doctoral dissertation on Gilded Age labor conditions when she stumbled upon a cache of documents that would consume the rest of her career. Hidden in a collection donated by a deceased attorney were photocopies of pages from Marcel Beaumont's ledger, the original having been seized and presumably destroyed by Vanderbilt family attorneys in 1924. How these copies survived and came into the attorney's possession remains unknown, but their existence proved that complete suppression had failed. Dr. Hartman spent 3 years verifying the document's authenticity through forensic analysis of paper, ink, and handwriting. She cross-referenced names in the ledger with missing persons reports from the era and found matches for 31 of the 47 documented victims. She located descendants of several victims and conducted oral history interviews that revealed family legends about relatives who had disappeared after taking work at wealthy estates. Her research was meticulous, comprehensive, and utterly damning. In 1970, Dr. Hartman submitted her dissertation and simultaneously sent copies of her findings to 3 major newspapers and 2 historical journals. The academic response was swift and devastating. Her dissertation committee rejected her work as insufficiently substantiated, despite her extensive documentation. The newspapers declined to publish her findings, citing concerns about libel lawsuits from wealthy families. The historical journals returned her manuscripts without review, stating the subject matter was inappropriate for scholarly publication. Within weeks, Dr. Hartman lost her position at the university where she had been teaching. Official reasons cited budget constraints, but colleagues later admitted that pressure had been applied by major donors with connections to the families named in her research. She found herself unable to secure another academic position anywhere in the country. Her research materials were demanded by university administrators who claimed they were technically university property. When she refused to surrender them, legal action was threatened. Dr. Hartman spent the next 15 years working as a high school teacher while continuing her research in isolation. She self-published a book in 1985 titled The Hidden Hunger: Cannibalism Among America's Gilded Age Elite, which was immediately subjected to a coordinated campaign of suppression. Major bookstores refused to stock it. Libraries declined to purchase copies. Reviews in mainstream publications dismissed it as conspiracy theory. The few copies that sold became collector's items among researchers interested in suppressed history. In 1992, Dr. Hartman was found dead in her apartment, officially from a heart attack at age 58. However, colleagues noted that she had been in excellent health and had recently mentioned receiving threatening phone calls. Her research materials, including the original photocopies of Beaumont's ledger, disappeared from her apartment before police arrived. The official investigation concluded that no foul play was involved, and the case was closed within days. Her family's attempts to recover her research materials were unsuccessful, with authorities claiming no such materials had been found. The treatment of undocumented immigrants in modern America also echoes historical patterns. Hundreds of immigrants disappear each year under circumstances that receive minimal investigation. Labor trafficking operations enslave thousands of people, often with the knowledge or complicity of wealthy individuals and corporations. The barriers preventing effective investigation and prosecution, lack of resources for investigating crimes against the powerless, fear within immigrant communities of reporting to authorities, and political will to ignore exploitation are remarkably similar to those that protected the Gilded Age network. The question of whether organized cannibalism specifically could occur today among the elite is more complex. Modern forensics, communication technology, and social awareness create obstacles that didn't exist in 1890. However, the fundamental dynamic that enabled such crimes, the conviction among some extremely wealthy individuals that their privilege places them above conventional morality, remains very much alive. The specific form transgression takes may evolve, but the underlying psychology of power-seeking ultimate expression through taboo violation continues. What we can say with certainty is that the Vanderbilt network represents not an isolated historical curiosity, but rather a case study in how power operates to protect itself. The crimes were enabled by wealth, facilitated by complicit institutions, and perpetuated through systematic suppression of truth. Every one of these elements remains present in contemporary society. The specifics change, but the fundamental patterns persist. The legacy of those 47 men whose identity cards were found in 1924, and the hundreds of others who disappeared into the network, is not just their individual tragedies, but what their fate reveals about the relationship between power and accountability in America. They were murdered not by criminals operating outside society's bounds, but by society's most respected members, people whose wealth and status placed them at the apex of American civilization. Their deaths were not investigated because institutions designed to pursue justice served the interests of their killers instead. For the descendants of these victims, scattered across America and around the world, the suppression of this history represents an ongoing injustice. Families never learned what happened to their relatives, never received acknowledgement or compensation, and now face active efforts to deny that these crimes occurred at all. The refusal to acknowledge this history extends the original crime by erasing victims from memory and protecting the reputations of the families that murdered them. The researcher and journalists who attempted to expose this truth, Thomas Brennan, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, Michael Torres and others, paid heavy prices for their courage. They lost careers, faced legal persecution, and in some cases died under suspicious circumstances. Their treatment demonstrates that speaking truth to power remains dangerous, particularly when that truth threatens the foundation myths of American society. The idea that wealth is earned through merit, that justice is blind to status, and that America's greatness rests on moral superiority rather than exploitation of the vulnerable. As we close this investigation into the Vanderbilt wine cellar secret, we must confront what this history demands of us today. We cannot undo the crimes of the past or bring justice to victims long dead, but we can refuse to participate in the ongoing suppression of truth. We can demand that institutions serve justice rather than power. We can recognize that the vulnerable members of our society today face dangers that echo those faced by immigrant workers in 1890. And we can resist the seductive mythology that extreme wealth reflects virtue, rather than the willingness to exploit others. The hidden chamber beneath Riverside Manor is gone, filled in or demolished decades ago. But the moral cavity it represented, the absolute void of empathy that allowed wealthy families to view other human beings as consumable commodities, that emptiness still exists wherever extreme power meets extreme privilege. Until we address the fundamental inequalities that enable such horrors, we risk discovering new forms of transgression hidden behind new walls of wealth and respectability. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe such organized crimes could occur today among the extremely wealthy? The dynamics that enabled the Vanderbilt network remain present in modern society, changed in form but not in fundamental character. Share this video with someone who's not afraid to question the mythology of American exceptionalism and confront the reality that evil often wears expensive suits and lives in mansions. If this investigation has opened your eyes to the secrets that wealthy families have suppressed for generations, subscribe to our channel for more hidden truths that challenge official narratives. Hit that notification bell because we're committed to uncovering stories that powerful institutions want buried forever. The 47 men whose identity cards were found in that cold storage chamber deserved better than to be murdered for the entertainment of the rich. They deserved better than to have their deaths suppressed and denied. At minimum, they deserve to be remembered, and for the truth of what happened to them to be told despite every effort to keep it hidden. This is their memorial, built not from marble but from words, preserved not in archives controlled by the powerful but in the collective memory of those willing to face uncomfortable truths. The Gilded Age ended, but the appetites it satisfied and the mechanisms it used to avoid accountability did not. They evolved, adapted, and continue to operate today in forms we might not recognize but which serve the same essential function, allowing the powerful to transgress with impunity while the vulnerable pay the price. Remembering the Vanderbilt network is not about dwelling on historical horrors but about recognizing patterns that repeat and insisting that next time, this time we will not look away.